The imperial palace in Constantinople was a magnificent sight. It was envied by the world, not just for its beautiful edifice, but for the power and the wealth it projected. However, deep below were the dungeons, home to villains, criminals, and political prisoners alike, slowly being tortured and left to rot away. The young man who had been recently imprisoned there was the latter. His very existence was now a political threat to the new regime who had taken power. His fortune had finally run out. A mere week and a half before, he was more than a starving body chained in a dark cell. He was at that point nothing less than the Emperor of the Eastern Roman Empire. He was known as Alexios IV. He had been a prisoner before when his father was usurped by his uncle. At that time, the then Prince Alexios had managed to flee the city and then rerouted the Fourth Crusade along with the entire Venetian fleet to Constantinople. In an amazing display of perseverance, he and his Western allies had taken the great city on the Bosphorus in 1203. But it was now February 8th, 1204. Heavy footsteps could be heard approaching his cell. The door flew open, and the new emperor, Alexios V of the Dukas family, entered. This new emperor could no longer tolerate the young man's life. An army of bloodthirsty crusaders camped out near his walls wanted the prior regime to be restored. Alexios V Dukas had deprived his prisoner of food and water, instead providing him with drinks of hemlock for a merciful way out, but these were rejected. At which point, Alexios V decided to take matters into his own hands, literally. He approached the chained figure before him, and clasping his hands around the prisoner's throat, proceeded to strangle the life out of him. The murder of the young Alexios IV was the breaking point of Byzantine and Crusader relations. It was now going to be a war to the death. But this critical and precarious situation had not always been the case. Six months before, the young prince and his allies had won an outstanding, albeit surprising, victory. When the prince's uncle, Alexios III, had fled, Constantinople was left without an emperor. At which point, the prince's father, Isaac II, was brought out of prison, dusted off, and placed on the throne. For the Latin Crusaders, it was a time to remember. To them, they had restored the young Prince Alexios to his inheritance, and thus they felt justified in their actions. The leaders of the Fourth Crusade were then brought into the city, ushered into the imperial palace, and celebrated their success. John Phillips, in his book The Fourth Crusade, recounts the tale, which carries just a bit of foreshadowing. Quote, "They were taken into one of the ceremonial halls, and there, waiting for them, was the Byzantine court in all its splendor. At the end of the hall, seated on the imperial thrones, was Isaac II and his wife Margaret, the sister of King Amico of Hungary. Vilhadouin, again a chronicler of the Fourth Crusade, described the emperor as being dressed in the most costly robes imaginable. He was also quite taken by the empress, whom he described as a very beautiful woman. Vilhadouin appreciated the irony in seeing the couple seated there in such splendor, when only the previous day they had been held prisoners by the very same people who now fawned around them. If these people could change allegiance to one of their own so quickly, what could be said about their loyalty to outsiders?" End quote. When the feast was underway, Vilhadouin approached Emperor Isaac II to discuss business. He recounted to the elderly and blind ruler the vast promises that his son had made in order to bring the Crusaders to his rescue. Isaac's response when he took in the breadth of the promises that his son had made was stunned silence. He was absolutely horrified at what was now due to those who had liberated him. Later, the emperor met with Prince Alexios. They were both well aware that the treasury was depleted, and thus they determined they simply needed more time to repay what they owed. The Crusaders and the Venetians accepted this. They established Galata as their base and then awaited what was due. Relations were still cordial. Indeed, many in the ranks of the Fourth Crusade were happy to see the young prince crowned as co-emperor. If nothing else, it meant that they had a higher chance of getting paid. On August 1st, 1203, Prince Alexios, aged only 21, became Alexios IV. He now ruled the Eastern Roman Empire along with his father. Alexios IV got to work right away. To fulfill his first promise, he announced that the Greek Orthodox Church would submit itself to the authority of the Pope. For those in the Fourth Crusade, this move gave their endeavors some degree of legitimacy in the eyes of the West. But, as can be imagined, this didn't go over well with the Roman people. What would happen next would be even worse. Emperor Alexios IV paid the Venetians 50,000 marks, which was just an enormous sum, along with an additional 36,000 to the Doge personally. This paid off what the Crusaders owed Doge Dandolo and his people. However, according to what the emperor had promised, much more was still owed, but by now the treasury was completely empty. With desperation and a bloodthirsty army at his doorstep, Alexios IV resorted to raiding the churches of Constantinople en masse. Nikitas Koniates, a more contemporary chronicler, described what he felt was the destruction of the empire's integrity. Quote, "In utter violation of the law, he touched the untouchable, whence I think the Roman state was totally subverted and disappeared. The emperor's men went to their work with vigor. It was a sight to behold. The holy icons of Christ consigned to the flames, after being hacked to pieces with axes and cast down, their adornments carelessly and unsparingly removed by force, and the revered and all-hallowed vessels seized from the churches with utter indifference, then melted down and given to the enemy troops as common silver and gold." End quote. The new emperor's approval rating dropped like a rock. He knew he was in an extremely precarious position. On one end, he had to keep his people and nobility happy while taking their money to give to the ravenous crusaders whose expectations never seemed to cease. At the same time, Alexios knew that the crusader presence was all that kept him from being ousted from power and likely executed. In exasperation, he would remark to them, "The Greeks, I must tell you, hate me because of you. If you leave me, I shall lose my empire, and they will put me to death." Thus, when the Venetian contract was set to expire in September, Alexios offered them even more to stay. Money worked. Doge Dandolo agreed, committing his men to stay in the service of the crusade till Christmas of 1204. For better and for worse, Alexios had managed to retain the services of the Crusader army for yet another year. Expensive as they were, not only to pay but also to room and board, he had to do that as well, they did serve their purpose. The emperor's people and aristocracy stayed in line. Fear of another attack and, more importantly, another fire was just too much of a risk for them to take, at least at this point. Now, as he did have these men in his employment, Alexios decided that he was going to put them to work. It was, after all, a very experienced army at this point. Shortly after he came to power, in mid-August, he set out with his allies on campaign to reassert his dominance over his newly won empire. This force moved west into Thrace, towards Adrianople, where Alexios III, again his uncle, had fled. Many cities along the way acknowledged the young emperor as sovereign. These very same cities were then systematically shaken down for as much money as they could cough up. With a powerful army at your back and the reputation that they carried, no one is going to disagree with handing over tribute. Now, it was later remarked by historians that the young Alexios IV seemed to come into his own and prosper commanding this force. He gained confidence and prestige with his relatively successful campaign under his belt. Granted, it wasn't a complete success. His uncle, Alexios III, escaped and went further west. What's more, the king of Bulgaria, Iohannis, whose kingdom had broken away from Greek rule in the 1180s, failed to recognize him as a ruler. This, by the way, would come back to haunt the Byzantines down the line. Now, the rest of his campaign was uneventful, but Alexios' homecoming to the great city would be anything but tranquil. On August 19, 1203, just a few days after the emperor and his crusading force had left on campaign, a major fight broke out in the city. It was going to be a fight between Greek and Latin. 2 decades prior, in 1182, the Byzantine people had slaughtered their Latin neighbors in Constantinople. In what was known as the Latin Massacre, the blood of Europeans from the West, that is, men, women, and children, filled the streets of the Queen of Cities. Now it was time for payback. Latin soldiers, sensing a chance for revenge, piled into the fight, and the brawl became into a massive confrontation. In the middle of all this, a fire broke out. While the fire that broke out on July 17th during the Venetian attack was bad enough, this new blaze would make it pale in comparison. In the dry summer heat, the fire grew out of control. It scorched a path from the Golden Horn all the way south to the Sea of Marmara. The firestorm was so intense that ships sailing by were set ablaze. The fire gutted the heart of the city, cutting a path of destruction that was estimated to be over 440 acres large. John Phillips described the scene, quote, "The fire twisted and meandered like a starving beast, gorging itself on everything in its path. It was not just the wooden buildings that fell prey to the inferno. The great agora was consumed. Its elegant porticos toppled to the ground, while mighty columns were ensnared and licked to destruction by the flames. The Crusaders, based on the opposite shore, the Golden Horn in Galata, could only watch as the fire devoured great churches, huge private houses, and wide streets packed with merchant shops. Smoke billowed into the skies, the flames leaped from building to building. Screams of the trapped and dying pierced the air. The crackle of burning wood, the abrasive rattle of disintegrating stonework, the percussive thud of falling masonry, pierced by the sharper staccato crack of shattering roof tiles. And all of this would come together to generate a truly hellish noise." End quote. When Alexios IV returned to his city, he was a detested man. His people blamed him for bringing these intruders and for the violence that they had wrought, which had now crescendoed into this conflagration. The young emperor's position would only deteriorate further as he continued to strip churches, including the Hagia Sophia, of their treasures to pay the Western soldiers. As summer turned to autumn and then into winter, the situation in the great city became ever more critical. In fact, despite the Crusader occupying force, the people of Constantinople would turn increasingly to violence. Angry mobs began to form, skirmishes became more intense, and one man in particular, Alexios Dukas, a nobleman known as Mort Zouflos, who ironically was freed from prison by the emperor's regime, became the tip of the spear of the anti-Crusade faction. Alexios Dukas would personally lead his men to attack the foreign occupiers, barely escaping death in a few encounters. Byzantine Crusader clashes got worse. As the fighting intensified, the Byzantine would then also turn their anger against the Venetian fleet. In early 1204, fire ships were sent into the armada that was docked in the Golden Horn, and this was done on more than just one occasion. It was only the skill of Danheim sailors that managed to keep the damage done to the Venetian ships at a minimum. Meanwhile, to make matters even more precarious, Alexios IV declared in December of 1203 that he would stop payments to the Crusaders, to which the Crusader High Command responded that if refused payment, they would do everything in their power to recover the money due. Doge Dandolo, when he heard about this, was furious and would remark, quote, "Wretched boy, we dragged you out of the filth, and into the filth we will cast you again. I defy you and give you warning that if you do not pay, I will do you all the harm in my power from this moment forwards." End quote. Alexios IV was trapped in the middle of a war that was erupting all around him. The only real question for him now was which side was the greater threat. Ultimately, and kinda sadly, the greatest blow would now fall from his own court. On the night of January 27th, 1204, Alexios Dukas, again the nobleman known as Mort Zouflos, made his move. He had already secured the treasury by bribing the officials in charge. He had convinced the Varangian Guard to join his side by telling them that the emperor was about to let the Crusaders enter the city. Then, in the middle of the night, with an armed escort, he entered the sleeping chambers of Alexios IV, had him literally dragged from his bed and thrown into a prison cell. It happened like clockwork, and there was almost no resistance. Alexios Dukas then cemented his victory. Within hours, he was declared by his people as the new emperor, and later crowned on February 5th, 1204 as Alexios V. Yeah, that's right, another Alexios, because, hey, that's just how history is sometimes. When the prior elderly co-emperor Isaac II heard of his son's imprisonment, he grew ill and died soon after, at least according to the record. Assassination or poisoning would not have been that far out of context here. Alexios V immediately took an offensive stance and demanded that the Venetians and the Latin Crusaders depart in 7 days, or, as he would say, face death. During that time, the new emperor got ready for an all-out war. The walls of Constantinople were reinforced, wooden barriers were added to the top of the seawalls, and supplies were brought into the city. It needs to be pointed out that even though the Byzantine army outnumbered the Latin one, it was not as cohesive a fighting force. The Crusaders at this point were a well-honed fighting machine. The Roman army, on the other hand, suffered from decades of neglect. Indeed, in one major encounter between Alexios V and a Latin foraging party, the emperor sent in an overwhelming 4,000 men only to watch them get routed. Alexios V in this engagement had to flee so quickly that he dropped his imperial standard. With direct confrontation not working out so well, the emperor resorted to diplomacy. On February 7th, he sent an envoy to negotiate. This envoy promised money if the Crusaders just simply left. This was promptly rejected. The Crusaders would have nothing to do with this new emperor. They wanted the young Alexios IV back in the throne. It was clear to the new regime now that this young man's life could no longer be tolerated. The very next day, Alexios V killed his predecessor. There would now only be war. Both sides now geared up for the confrontation. Alexios V rallied his men as best as he could and continued to fortify his walls. The Crusaders and their Venetian allies came together in March of 1204 to plan what to do next. They felt that leaving and going to the Holy Land empty-handed was not exactly optimal. Instead, they planned to attack and conquer. Indeed, their confidence was so high that they decided then and there how to divide the Eastern Empire once the city was taken. The attack came on April 9th, 1204 and was directed against the seawalls where the Venetians had had their success the prior year. The Crusaders arrived at the northwest portion of the city and disembarked in front of the walls. Scaling ladders and battering rams were brought to bear under the cover of a massive crossbow and catapult attack. Morale was high. The thirst for fame and fortune overcame the fears of a quick death. But the defenders were equally determined and for once had a committed leadership. Alexios V set up a forward command base at the monastery of Pantepoptis, where he directed his men fiercely. He knew that as defenders, they had the advantage. The improved defenses with the elevated wooden walls on top of the stone seawalls were too high for the Venetians to simply drop down on top of. The attackers were left to a dismal prospect of a direct assault, to which the Byzantine fought back. Scaling ladders were pushed down, boiling oil drenched the attackers. Scores of arrows inflicted heavy casualties. Both sides fought tenaciously, but as the day wore on, the backbone of the Crusaders' strike faltered. They were first pushed back, and then their retreat became an all-out rout. At the end of that day, it became evident that the attack had failed. However, Crusader determination and Venetian ingenuity did not diminish. Doge Dandolo ordered his ships lashed together so that even larger siege towers could be constructed on top of them, giving his men the ability to go over the heightened defenses of the city. On April 12, 1204, the fight began anew. Once again, the Crusaders rushed the defenses of the seawall. Once again, the defenders held the line. Casualties began to mount up, and it looked like it was going to be another defeat for the Crusaders. Then, suddenly, a strong wind came in and pushed the Venetian ships so close to the walls that their masts touched the towers. The Doge immediately rallied his men to seize this opportunity. His men climbed to the top of the siege towers. There, balanced 95 feet above, swaying back and forth with the waves below, they had to time their jumps well. One can only ponder what would drive a man to such action. While some fell 9 stories to their death, many landed on the walls and began a ferocious fight with the elite Varangian guard that awaited them below. Meanwhile, at ground level, the fight continued. John Phillips brings this to life. Quote, Peter, the Lord of Amiens, took the initiative. He realized the importance of creating a hole in the wall at sea level. When he caught sight of a small bricked-up gate, he resolved to breach it. Some of his men crouched down to break through the wall. Their colleagues hunched over them using shields for protection against the missiles that rained down upon them. When the Greeks saw the Crusaders' intentions, they rushed to defend the gate. A deluge of crossbow bolts and stones rained down into the Crusaders' screen of shields. The Byzantines brought up vats of boiling pitch and Greek fire and poured them down into the Westerners. But, by a miracle of God, the Crusaders seemed not to have been seriously burned or crushed. The determination of these men was remarkable. It is on such acts of courage that entire wars can be turned. Axes, swords, bars, and picks were used to shatter the brickwork, and thus, finally, they created a ragged hole through which they could enter the city. End quote. The Latins rushed through the breach. No more than 70 initially made it through, but this had a major effect on Byzantine morale, which began to deteriorate. The emperor tried to rally his men, but a tipping point had been reached. More towers along the wall were taken. Their gates were thrown wide open. And then the fight began to spread into the city. Eventually, even Alexios' forward base was overrun. The conflict would continue well into the night as the Eastern Romans began to fall back. During the assault, another fire broke out, the third that the Crusaders had brought, and with that, morale collapsed. The people of the city panicked and began to flee entirely. Seeing the collapse imminent, that night, Alexios V gathered what money he could and around midnight abandoned Constantinople. With his abandonment, a desperate nobility elected a warrior by the name of Constantine Lascaris to be the next emperor. But despite his boasting that he could turn the tide, he too realized that the cause was hopeless. He too would abandon the city, making it 3 emperors to do so in a 10-month period. When news of this spread, even the Varangian guard ran. When the sun arose the next day, all resistance was over. The city was taken, and one of the greatest sacks since the fall of Rome was about to begin. John Julius Norwich, in his book, A Short History of Byzantium, conveys the magnitude of this catastrophe. Quote, "Once the walls were breached, the carnage was dreadful. Only at nightfall did the conquerors call a truce and withdraw to their camp in one of the great squares of the city. The next morning they awoke to find all resistance at an end. But for the people of Constantinople, the tragedy had scarcely begun. Not for nothing had the Franks waited so long outside the world's richest capital. Now that the customary 3 days looting was allowed to them, they fell on it like locusts. Never since the barbarian invasions had Europe witnessed such an orgy of brutality and vandalism. Never in history had so much beauty, so much superb craftsmanship been wantonly destroyed in so short a space of time. The Fourth Crusade, if indeed it can be so described, surpassed even its predecessors in faithlessness and duplicity, in brutality and greed. By the sack of Constantinople, Western civilization suffered a loss greater than the sack of Rome in the 5th century or the burning of the Library of Alexandria in the 7th. Byzantium never recovered. Instead, the empire was left powerless to defend itself. There are few greater ironies in history than the fact that the fate of Eastern Christendom should have been sealed by men who fought under the banner of the cross." End quote. After the sack, what was left was brought together and divided. The Venetians received 150,000 marks, the French Crusaders 50,000, with an additional 100,000 divided up amongst them. This was an immense wealth, which far outstripped the income of the great kings of Western Europe. But it didn't end there. Constantinople was also systematically stripped of its culture. Aside from the loss of wealth, ornaments and books, statues and tomes of knowledge were destroyed. The loss for humanity was priceless. Even the triumphal quadriga, the 4 huge gilded bronze horses that were on display in the hippodrome, were taken down. They were shipped west as a trophy of war. To this very day, they reside on the facade of St. Marco's Basilica in Venice. The lands of the once proud Eastern Empire were divided into a multitude of states, many coming under the occupation of foreign rulers. Constantinople and its surrounding lands would now become the Latin Empire. The Crusaders debated at length who would be its new ruler. Eventually, Baldwin of Flanders, with his deep connections with the Venetians, was, quote, elected to be in charge. The Eastern Romans themselves would go on to establish 3 successor states: the Empire of Nicaea, which would be governed by the Lascarid dynasty, the Empire of Trebizond under the Comnenid, and the Despotate of Epirus with the Dukas family. But perhaps we're getting too far ahead. Returning to Constantinople on May 16, 1204, just a month after the city fell, a new emperor, a Latin emperor, was being crowned. John Phillips brings this decisively home, and I quote, "Baldwin walked to the altar of the Hagia Sophia, partially damaged during the conquest. At the altar, after Baldwin had knelt in prayer to give thanks for the Crusaders' victory, the bishops stripped him to the waist to signify his humility before God. They anointed him, redressed him, and finally gathered around him. Each held the crown with one hand, and then they blessed it, making the sign of the cross before placing it on his head. Then they withdrew to reveal the new emperor of Constantinople in all his magnificence, a tangible manifestation of the power and the riches that the Crusaders had seized. Baldwin sat on a high throne, holding in one hand a scepter and in the other a golden orb. One can only imagine his feelings and thoughts as he faced the huge crowd, all magnificently attired in jeweled and silken robes. As the congregation chanted the Mass, Baldwin's mind perhaps turned to his northern European home, the cold, marshy lands of Flanders. He may have thought of the wife he would now summon to be his empress. He could have reflected upon his illustrious crusading ancestors. He may have remembered the suffering and sacrifice of his fellow men as they fought to capture Constantinople. Finally, amidst all the opulence and excitement at the dawning of a new era, he may have remembered that the Fourth Crusaders had first set out to recapture the holy city of Jerusalem and not to destroy, as they had, the greatest civilization in Christendom. End quote.